try it again. And we're not gonna have it narrate the whole thing yet anymore.
For each bit of that man's genome has a three-dimensional relationship to bits of each of its predecessor sequences, which were chosen millions of generations before it. Thus, a new man has no relation to one particular piece of DNA because no human man in his ancestors' history could beget the man himself, so only one other ancestor does the begetting, and so on. There is an arrow pointing from every human's genes to their past, to every ancestor, to an endless sequence of ancestors, to all the generations of ancestors in their biological history, right back to a very distant point in evolutionary history, to a very distant prokaryotic organism, if not more remote still, to the Big Bang itself. All human genomes share these common ancestors, this family, which are millions of generations further apart. And what if you imagine an ancient prokaryotic cell has acquired a large bit of DNA because it acquired it by a long-forgotten route at an ancestral time long enough ago so that it couldn't know its provenance, even though this gene will do no actual work in the organism, and in fact is a new essence that every mutation it acquires is filtered out still in its vast biological family of 100 million generations of ancestors. Some ancestor somewhere back in the past might have needed the gene for some unknown purpose and bequeathed it to the new organism in its makeup, not knowingly perhaps, but by an irreversible train of descent, so that now there it was, and to create a natural selection program to cross-check for mutation and chromosomal rearrangement of each of its proteins, and therefore of all the genes, is much, much easier than for natural selection. For natural selection in evolutionary time has one opportunity and is restrained from fiddling by death. So each error must be considered separately for every hominid with all its consequences for fitness. And where it fails, one is dead. Where the artificial evolution program fails, a particular DNA copy can be excised, frozen for 1,000,000 years, and be analyzed before it is transmitted back to a future member of its genetic family. Wherever a gene that is useful for an organism, say, for repairing a bone, say shows up in the lineage of its ancestors, artificial evolution will reach back until the ancestor actually did need to make it, not knowingly but as an automatic function, so the new member of the family inherits it. It would take many eons to do the analysis, but artificial evolution would achieve it, even with errors that must be discarded because they cannot be fathomed. The best failures become successes, the worst losses, but only successes. Even before he discovered the concepts of evolutionary programming, Friedman began to ask if some evolutionary algorithm could make a bit of new genetic information for his organism in place of random mutations. He chose as his candidates such DNA molecules as deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, proteins, and RNA. But how? Evolutionary algorithms are iterative, for their search processes do not generate just a single trial and stop. That would be as futile as trying to boil all the oceans. They loop one algorithm many times. While slowly each bit is different, slowly an imperfect design is approximated. Genetic algorithms like to fail, only to be saved. All evolutionary algorithms run from a finite set of problems, but Friedman did not even have an absolute stop-go, but to apply it was not to begin. Rather, he aimed to iteratively fix the search process just before the number of generations fell to one or fewer and stopped. Evolutionary algorithms run stochastically in space, and as stochastic as that seems to a mathematical scientist, it is not sufficiently chaotic to count for zero when calculating the chance of obtaining a particular solution. Only the probability that two solutions exist on the same physical space at a given instant. An attempted solution of a genetic algorithm will fail, or alternatively pass. If it is attempted at generation 3, generation 4 may also fail, or if it succeeds at generation 4, the whole process of iterative tests at generations 4, 5, 6, etc. may fail. However, because each generation may also produce a second success, even if there have been two successive generations in which the solution had not been good enough, the possibility is always open that one will result in a perfect solution at one or the other, or even both the previous failures. This means that the attempt on a successful genetic algorithm that did not end there, but is passed over and tried again, will always succeed on its own second try, for its parent must have done that on its previous first failure. It may run just a few more generations and it may produce yet another new successful attempt. But no matter how many successive failures of its parent on every such trial, this iterative algorithm will still produce the right answer, at least according to the artificial intelligence, the computer, programmer or genetic programmer, which has no knowledge of what its search is, as has natural selection, but without knowledge of what the genetic program is aiming at. One cannot tell if a particular instance of evolution is or is not on track, since natural selection or natural endosynthesis did not produce an answer, which could be disastrous if they were programmed not to give any. And if you would, with this blind optimism, instead of trying the different sequences one by one in every generation, which can only ever work if you do not or cannot judge of the result, because for the laws of programming and natural selection and all other entities, not knowing an answer is an answer. Therefore, no result. The artificial evolution can start on a second line after only a few attempts and get started over like that. Why not try two first lines, then like that, and two first lines after that, and another, as artificial selection starts its attempts anew every time it does not hit on success at one line. It seems an easy matter to create an infinity of successive iterations without any of them reaching the end. This is known as a self-replicating system, or suggestively an immortalist. But without knowing how artificial selection makes progress on a specific trial, what to a blind man are all these success attempts after every iteration? While creating a synthetic prokaryotic organism to simulate how natural selection creates genetic information through copying is straightforward. Building a program for an artificial algorithm of genetic programming that operates to create novel organic sequences in the same way, especially using RNA, has proved so challenging that the experiments remain controversial, or at least in conflict. There have been various reported methods successful in that they are always an actual method, because there is nothing artificial about natural selection of getting sequences for particular amino acids just by shifting bits in and out. while leaving other bits of DNA unaltered in any way so that each copy of the same sequence does not use all its original amino acid sequences. That is, no identical amino acid gets copied twice, while all the amino acids in the chain have, therefore, somehow been moved into different positions in the sequence. Mason, 1995. Although this would be difficult by any means, because the ends of a segment of DNA will overlap, still, one would hope natural selection might do it that way to create genetic information if there were such a mechanism as indeed the quantum model requires. Natural selection usually fails a good deal on the first mutation in every generation, but most of these later ones, without resulting in death, usually yield enough function for a body part that permits survival for some period of time, say some vital limb. So with all its failures, and indeed on average it would produce about two, but in all the endless possible lines of an algorithm to find these optimum designs, perhaps a mere two. So the more a second solution can do, like saying something just after an evading nod in the first failure to Turing test, the better the genetic algorithm or endosynthesis, and the greater its potential. So even though Darwin had many examples of proteins being copied like hemoglobin, which he thought was probably copied just at each individual cell, he did not realize that proteins and nucleic acids and everything in biology was only an evolution-proof way of constructing information as DNA could. That is, one way, although a vastly more sophisticated one, just as the kennel had never thought it had been dug by humans before discovering it was their home. In this way, Darwin might be said to have imagined that what we know about Darwin is not what we are about Darwin. We are not merely talking about him. He was himself only a path to the evolution of natural selection itself, to our thinking about it as it might have come, except that to understand something and not know that it is really only part of what one is about to know, one would have to not be one. We cannot know or not be. One reason why such artificial genetic programs do not run out, or turn around themselves and improve themselves, or act so that there is a guaranteed loop and end. Because without end and end, even natural selection doesn't find all of the evolutionary optimum. We need, perhaps, some standard test in the end. What sort of program do you end with? With an immortalist. One which, for lack of the standard, won't play by ear? The self-improving immortalist is more powerful than the simple evolution process, and Friedman realized that in their continual runnings they'd actually mutate more than in natural selection. Natural selection's evolutionary changes are fixed by selection. To a high degree, fixed by selection. This, unlike Darwin, he understood it is like a strong gene within an organism, poor thing for strength or cunning, which survives within the genetic family tree, which survives generations of being passed down. For reasons not known or imagined for centuries after the strength or cunning had passed. For only very strong or very cunning can survive, even with no death penalty for an evolutionary runaround, that is, even for lack of extinction. If a given individual dies without procreation, like the caterpillar that lost its beautiful outside, just so long as it got in one last orgy of eating or loving before. This was, however, not how he thought. How a truly rational programmer must think of these optimum sequences under evolutionary pressure. A strong and cunning survival program it may be, is actually better at improving itself, so it will have been already.
Damn
To
children.
always avoid such obvious disaster and actually improve itself instead of decreasing over time. Cunning of mind is therefore probably more beneficial than strong survival of body, with perhaps the occasional organism of both, even if a good organism for itself cannot outsmart others, so it would survive, but not excel and actually stay small, although perhaps just large enough to rule it over, having learned that in every species and class there was always the right place, so its genome was not reduced and destroyed by some stronger process from the outside, as happens for all genes outside for which an organism has no need. Remember that all other species were excluded from that small chance and made it through. Their great genes have their great programs. They did not save the best in the future only because they could not predict its future. While our forefathers predicted for their genes our life would evolve and learn through a big repetition, life began almost immediately in a selective space, too wide for such slow organisms, and began again with our fathers, thereby further narrowed down the evolutionary landscape of possible solutions, especially because those who died could be reduced through their progeny to two in one place. This may be so in one direction, producing many tricks to hide the catastrophic dangers, but this is not necessarily so in the other. It is perhaps reasonable that these various strengths so cunning are created at a population-wide level, even in Darwinian terms still. A rational programmer may argue, can artificial programs even run faster in Darwinian time? Darwin did not realize, for he believed he could never mistake two evolution processes of his own discovery, not just at the level of the organism. Natural selection has little choice in where to spend its energy. It is like an engineer working on the remote frontiers of an expanding solar system in some massive infrastructure project whose defense, production, and prosperity require hundreds of separate directions. Therefore, the programmer and not that meat is what makes it rational. A good designer, whereas in biology, natural selection does not have one. Tit for tat. Gets everything it needs. In every generation through emergent optimization. It may take a great many generations until that sort of internal evolutionary progress, a route to progress, is available, because for those early individuals it may have been lost as quickly as that. For what could one achieve? Thus, Friedman pointed out, we do not have the information needed to compute it for an endosynthesis algorithm or the genetic algorithms with this control parameter. This is what was problematic for him.
Alright, that's it. That's it.